Spanish Armada. The year was 1588, and Spain sailed the most feared fleet in the world, 130 ships, nearly 30,000 men, launched by King Philip II to crush Protestant England and stop Queen Elizabeth I. Spain's goal was nothing less than invasion, restoring Catholic control and ending English piracy against Spanish treasure. But the invincible Armada met a nightmare. English tactics, under commanders like Sir Francis Drake, used faster, more maneuverable ships and long-range cannons to keep Spain off balance. While England scored key hits, the real killer was the sea itself. Relentless storms hammered the fleet as it tried to retreat north around Scotland and Ireland. Ship after ship wrecked. Nearly half were lost, with an estimated 20,000 Spanish sailors dead. More to weather and starvation than battle. For England, it was a stunning underdog victory. The small island nation had survived the empire that ruled half the globe. For Spain, it marked the slow decline of a superpower. And for Europe, it reshaped balance of power, England emerging as a rising naval force, beginning its path toward global empire. The Armada's shattered hulls proved a simple truth. Even the mightiest fleets can be sunk not just by enemy fire, but by the fury of nature.
The Batavia shipwreck. In June of 1629, the Batavia, pride of the Dutch East India Company, struck hidden reefs off Western Australia during her very first voyage to the Indies. More than 300 people survived the wreck and scrambled onto barren islands. But if the sea hadn't killed them, savagery soon would. While the captain left in a small boat to get help, chaos took over. A merchant named Euronymous Cornelis seized control, turning the tiny camp into a nightmare. He and his followers murdered roughly 125 castaways, men, women, even children, in a campaign of terror to secure food, water, and power. Survivors were forced into slavery, and those who resisted were slaughtered. But a small band of loyal soldiers, exiled to a nearby island, fought back. When rescue ships finally returned months later, they exposed Cornelis's mutiny and executed him and his accomplices on the spot. The Batavia tragedy became infamous not just as a shipwreck, but as proof of how quickly civilization can collapse in isolation. What began as a voyage of trade and empire ended as one of history's darkest lessons. Sometimes the deadliest enemy at sea is not the storm, but human nature itself.
La Salle's expedition. In 1684, French explorer René Robert Cavelier de La Salle set sail with 4 ships and hundreds of settlers, ordered by King Louis XIV to plant a colony near the mouth of the Mississippi River. It was meant to secure France's grip on North America. But from the very start, the voyage unraveled. Navigational errors pushed them hundreds of miles west, landing not at the Mississippi, but on the hostile coast of Texas. One ship was seized by Spanish privateers, another sank, and the surviving colonists were stranded in an unforgiving wilderness with little food. Disease, native conflict, and poor leadership bled morale away. As months turned to years, starvation and desperation poisoned the group. La Salle himself made repeated treks inland trying to find the Mississippi, but failure followed each step. By 1687, patience snapped. A group of his own men mutinied and shot him dead in the Texas plains. Only a handful of survivors ever staggered back to French outposts. The expedition meant to expand an empire instead collapsed in blood and misery, a reminder that ambition without direction can turn exploration into a death march.
The Treasure Fleet Tragedy. In the summer of 1715, Spain launched a treasure fleet from Havana, 12 heavily laden ships carrying silver, gold, and jewels from the Americas back to Europe. Together, they held a fortune meant to fund the Spanish crown and sustain its empire. But just days into the voyage, disaster struck. Off the coast of Florida, a massive hurricane rolled in. Winds shredded sails, waves snapped ships like twigs. 11 of the 12 galleons were wrecked, smashed onto reefs and shores. In the chaos, an estimated 1,000 sailors lost their lives. Many survivors made it to land, but faced starvation and exposure under the brutal sun. The treasure, scattered along the seabed, lay hidden for centuries. Local indigenous groups recovered what they could, and later Spain sent salvage crews, but most of the riches remained lost. Even today, more than 300 years later, modern divers and treasure hunters still pull coins, jewelry, and artifacts from Florida's so-called Treasure Coast. For Spain, the fleet's loss was a financial and symbolic blow, proof of how fragile empire was when dependent on the sea. One storm turned unimaginable wealth into one of history's deadliest and most enduring shipwreck legends.
The Grosvenor Wreck. In August of 1782, the Grosvenor, a British East Indian Company merchant ship, was sailing home from India with a crew and passengers totaling over 150 people. On board were not only sailors, but also families, including women and children returning from colonial life. But off South Africa's brutal wild coast, disaster struck. In heavy seas, the Grosvenor smashed against hidden reefs and was torn apart. Many drowned instantly in the surf. About 123 people made it ashore, soaked, shaken, but alive. Yet survival on land proved harsher than the wreck itself. Food was scarce and the coastline offered no easy escape. Believing they could walk to Cape Town, nearly 400 miles away, the survivors attempted the impossible. Exhaustion, starvation, disease, and exposure began to claim them one by one. Local tribes offered limited aid, but the unforgiving trek across wilderness killed most. In the end, only a tiny handful ever reached European settlements alive. The fate of the Grosvenor stands as one of history's most tragic shipwreck sagas. Hundreds died not just in the wreck, but in the desperate march that followed. A cruel reminder that sometimes survival on land is far deadlier than the sea itself.
HMS Wager. In 1741, during Britain's war against Spain, the Royal Navy launched a daring expedition to harass Spanish colonies in South America. Among the fleet was HMS Wager, a warship packed with Marines, sailors, and valuable supplies. But off the wild coast of Chile, disaster struck. Navigating treacherous waters in storms, the Wager smashed onto rocks and broke apart. Around 140 survivors managed to reach a desolate shore, but survival quickly spiraled into chaos. Stranded in freezing winds with little food, men began to turn on each other. Half-starved and desperate, the castaways split into bitter factions, some loyal to their captain, others rebelling against his discipline. Quarrels turned violent. Executions, starvation, disease, and exposure claimed life after life. Eventually, only a fraction of the crew ever made it home, some in stolen boats, others in chains, facing court-martial. The wreck of the Wager became infamous, not just for the loss of life, but for revealing the brutal realities of naval discipline, mutiny, and survival. Memoirs and retellings spread across Europe, exposing that sometimes the greatest wreck isn't just of a ship, but of human order itself.
Franklin's Arctic Expedition. In 1845, Sir John Franklin led Britain's most ambitious voyage yet. 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, with 129 men, tasked to finally chart the fabled Northwest Passage through the Arctic. The ships are state-of-the-art, steam engines, reinforced hulls, and 3 years of provisions. On paper, it was unstoppable. But once the pack ice closed in, the expedition vanished. For years, nothing was heard. Search parties later found eerie clues, abandoned camps, scattered graves, and notes hinting that the ships had been locked in ice for 2 winters before crews attempted a desperate march south. None survived. Evidence later revealed that the men suffered from scurvy, starvation, frostbite, and likely lead poisoning from poorly preserved food. In the most desperate stages, signs even suggested cannibalism. The Arctic didn't just kill them, it consumed them. For over 160 years, the mystery haunted explorers until modern searches finally located the wrecks. Erebus in 2014, Terror in 2016, preserved on the seafloor like ghost ships, frozen in time.
Franklin's tragedy became a cautionary epic of human ambition against nature, the price of chasing glory at the edge of the world.
The Donner Party Trek. In 1846, nearly 90 pioneers, later known as the Donner Party, set out from Missouri in wagons, chasing dreams of new farmland and fortune in California. Their journey west should have taken 4 months, but one bad decision doomed them. Instead of staying on the established Oregon Trail, they followed a so-called shortcut, Hastings Cutoff. It was anything but short, adding tough mountain deserts, slowing their pace, and exhausting supplies. By October, as the group reached the Sierra Nevada, an early snowstorm sealed the mountain passes shut. They were trapped. Through that brutal winter, the emigrants faced deep snow, zero food, and freezing conditions. Roughly half died of starvation, exposure, or illness. In desperation, some survivors resorted to eating the bodies of the dead, a detail that has haunted the Donner name ever since. When rescue parties finally reached them months later, fewer than 50 remained alive. The Donner Party's tragedy became one of America's most infamous cautionary tales of migration, the price of haste, poor planning, and fate colliding with nature's cruelty. Their voyage west promised prosperity, but instead became a frozen nightmare carved into legend.
The Titanic. In April 1912, the RMS Titanic set out on her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. She was the pride of modern engineering. 9 decks, lavish luxury, and marketed as practically unsinkable. On board, more than 2,200 passengers and crew, from the world's wealthiest elites to immigrants chasing a new life. But on the night of April 14th, in the frigid North Atlantic, disaster struck. At nearly midnight, Titanic slammed into an iceberg. Water tore open her hull, and within 3 hours, the ship that symbolized human progress was gone beneath the waves. The true horror came not just from the sinking, but from the lack of lifeboats. There were seats for barely half the people aboard. Panic and chaos filled the decks as women and children were loaded first, while countless others, especially third-class passengers, were left trapped below. By sunrise, over 1,500 lives had been lost, making it one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters ever. The world was shocked. In the aftermath came sweeping changes: lifeboat requirements, 24-hour radio watches, international ice patrols. Yet more than a century later, Titanic endures not just as a shipwreck, but as a timeless reminder of human hubris versus the unforgiving sea.
The Sultana steamboat explosion. In April 1865, just days after the Civil War ended, thousands of weary Union soldiers, newly freed prisoners of war, crowded onto the steamboat Sultana on the Mississippi River. Designed to carry about 375 people, she was packed with more than 2,000. The Army paid captains by passenger, so greed and carelessness drove the decision. On the night of April 27th, near Memphis, tragedy struck. Overheated and poorly repaired, Sultana's boilers suddenly exploded. Fireballs and scalding steam tore through the decks, hurling men into the dark river. The overloaded boat burned to the waterline, leaving chaos in its wake. Many who survived the blast drowned in the strong current, trapped in wreckage, or too weak to swim after years in prison camps. In the end, between 1,200 and 1,800 lives were lost, 3 times more than the Titanic, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in U.S. history. Yet, outside the Mississippi Valley, the story was quickly overshadowed by breaking news: President Lincoln's assassination. For many survivors, their suffering barely reached the history books. The Sultana is remembered today as a national tragedy born of greed, neglect, and unimaginable human cost.
The Wilhelm Gustloff evacuation. In the final winter of World War II, desperate civilians and retreating German soldiers scrambled to flee the advancing Soviet army.
On January 30th, 1945, the liner Wilhelm Gustloff, a former Nazi cruise ship, was loaded far beyond capacity. Built for about 2,000 passengers, she carried over 10,000 men, women, and children packed into every available space. As the ship crossed the icy Baltic Sea, disaster struck. Soviet submarine S-13 fired 3 torpedoes into her side. Within minutes, chaos erupted. Freezing seawater crashed through the hull, lifeboats jammed, and panic filled the decks. The temperature outside was well below freezing. Many who leapt into the sea died instantly from hypothermia. By the time the Wilhelm Gustloff sank beneath the waves, around 9,000 people had been killed. That's 6 times more than the Titanic, the deadliest single sinking in maritime history. For decades, the tragedy remained little known outside Europe, buried by the wider destruction of the war. But today, the Wilhelm Gustloff stands as a stark reminder. In war, the line between soldier and civilian blurs, and the sea can become a graveyard on an unimaginable scale.
The SS Mont Blanc, Halifax explosion. On the morning of December 6, 1917, the French freighter Mont Blanc entered Halifax Harbor in Nova Scotia. Her cargo was a floating bomb, over 2,900 tons of explosives, TNT, picric acid, and benzol, destined for the First World War front. At the same time, another vessel, the Norwegian Imo, was leaving the harbor. In the narrow channel, the 2 ships miscalculated. At 8:45 a.m., they collided. Sparks ignited leaking benzol, setting the Mont Blanc ablaze. Few on shore knew what the freighter carried as crowds gathered at windows to watch the fire. Minutes later, the ship erupted. The blast equaled roughly 2,900 tons of TNT, the largest human-made explosion before the atomic bomb. The shockwave leveled entire neighborhoods, shattered glass for miles, and triggered a tsunami that wiped out Halifax's waterfront. Nearly 2,000 people were killed instantly, 9,000 injured, and over 25,000 left homeless. The disaster stunned the world, prompting new international rules for transporting dangerous cargo. To this day, the Halifax explosion serves as a stark reminder of how a single collision in the wrong place and time can unleash devastation that feels almost nuclear.
The Endurance voyage. In 1914, explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton set sail on HMS Endurance, determined to be the first to cross Antarctica by land. His crew of 27 men braved one of the harshest environments on Earth, the Weddell Sea, a frozen maze of shifting pack ice. But by January 1915, the Endurance was trapped. For months, the crew lived aboard as the ship groaned under the pressure of the ice. Finally, the hull gave way. The mighty Endurance was crushed and swallowed by the sea. Shackleton and his men were stranded, thousands of miles from help, with no radio and no hope of rescue. What followed was one of history's most incredible survival sagas. The crew camped on drifting ice floes, hunted seals and penguins to stay alive, and endured temperatures far below zero. Shackleton then led a daring 800-mile open boat journey across storm-torn seas to South Georgia Island. Against all odds, he returned with rescue, and every single man survived. The Endurance voyage remains legendary, not as a tale of death, but of leadership, resilience, and the sheer human will to survive when nature itself seemed determined to kill them.
The Lusitania. On May 7, 1915, the RMS Lusitania, one of the fastest and grandest passenger liners of her day, was nearing the coast of Ireland on her journey from New York to Liverpool. Over 1,900 people were on board, including families, businessmen, and travelers of many nations. But this was World War I, and the German Navy had declared the waters around Britain a war zone. Without warning, German submarine U-20 fired a single torpedo into the Lusitania's hull. Within just 18 minutes, the massive liner rolled and disappeared beneath the sea. The toll was catastrophic. Nearly 1,200 civilians died, among them 128 Americans. The images of drowned women, children, and neutral passengers shocked the world and shattered any illusion that civilians were safe at sea. Germany defended the attack, claiming Lusitania carried war supplies as well as passengers. But in global public opinion, outrage exploded, especially in the United States. Though America would not declare war until 1917, the sinking shifted attitudes and pushed the U.S. closer to joining the Allies. The Lusitania's voyage ended in tragedy, but its sinking became far more than a disaster at sea. It became a geopolitical flashpoint that changed the course of the 20th century.
The Medusa wreck. In 1816, the French frigate Medusa set sail for Senegal, carrying over 400 passengers, colonial officials, crew, and settlers. But incompetence at the helm doomed her. Poorly navigated, the Medusa ran aground off West Africa. Lifeboats could not hold everyone, so in panic, a crude raft was lashed together for 147 men and women. It was barely seaworthy, and food and water were almost non-existent. For 13 hellish days, survivors drifted under the burning sun. Hunger, thirst, and madness set in. Fights broke out, the weak were thrown overboard, and desperate men resorted to cannibalism. When rescuers finally found them, only 15 remained alive. The tragedy ignited scandal in France, exposing corruption and incompetence in the Navy. But it also seared itself into history through art. The painting The Raft of the Medusa by Géricault, a towering canvas that shocked Europe with its raw portrayal of suffering, death, and human desperation. The Medusa's voyage proved that disasters don't just live in records. They echo through culture, politics, and memory, long after the sea has swallowed the ship.